A while back, when my parents were trying to make their marriage work, they sent me to stay with my granddad for the summer. My granddad was a quiet man, which kept me at a distance from him, especially since I was his only grandson. When I learned I'd be spending a long stretch of summer with him, I wasn't exactly excited. Everything came to a head during one week in July. We ended up spending a lot of time at graveyards throughout northwestern Arkansas and parts of Missouri, winding through the back roads of the Ozark Mountains. At 12 years old, I thought we were visiting so many graveyards because my granddad was nearing the end himself. My grandmother had passed a few years earlier. But looking back, that couldn't have been it. He still had plenty of time left. What we were really doing was tracing family history. He'd pull up to an old cemetery, some markers dating back 100 years, and pull out a little notepad. He'd flip through the pages and then get out, hands on his hips, inspecting the area as if it were a crime scene. "That's not it," he'd mumble to himself, then turn around and shuffle through the rows of graves until he found the right tombstone. He'd pull out a piece of butcher paper and a black crayon, creating a rubbing of the grave's inscriptions. This whole trip wasn't exactly how I envisioned my summer. I longed for the typical activities, sleepovers, pools, bikes, and movies with friends. But I tried to be patient, even as boredom gnawed at me. After visiting a few more graveyards, we finally headed east as dusk settled in, the fading sun behind us. I hoped to find a place to stay for the night. It would be our 5th night on the road. I remembered only one time when we found a place with a pool, but that seemed unlikely in the rural areas we were passing through. We pulled up to a place called the Huckleberry Hotel, a small motel with single-story rooms in a row. It looked pretty empty. I stayed in the car while my granddad checked in, returning with a key. Once inside our room, I awkwardly flopped onto the bed, which felt like a rough mattress with a firm blanket. I searched for the remote and flipped through channels, wishing for something like MTV or Nickelodeon. But with my granddad in the room, I felt too self-conscious to watch those shows, so I settled for a rerun of Treasure and read a comic book instead. After a while, I ventured outside to find my granddad. He was standing in the parking lot, staring into the darkness while smoking a cigarette. "Did you get the ice?" he asked when he noticed me. "Not yet," I replied. This had become a ritual. Wherever we stopped, we filled up an ice bucket from the hotel's ice machine. It didn't matter if we didn't need it, just a quirk we stuck to. I headed toward the little alcove between the rooms and the office, where the Pepsi machine glowed enticingly. I pressed all the buttons, checking the coin slot, hoping for a free soda or at least some change. But I came up empty. The ice machine groaned when I tried to use it, and after a few attempts, I gave up and returned to the room, empty-handed. "Did you get it filled?" he asked, looking up from the bed as I set the empty bucket down. "No, it was broken." He sat up with a start. "What? So there's no ice?" He swung his legs off the bed, tying his boots. "I don't think so," I said, confused as to why this mattered so much to him. I had never seen him so agitated. "Come on, let's go check," he insisted. His pace quickened as we made our way to the office. You wouldn't think he was upset if you saw him, but knowing him, agitated, was the word that came to mind. At the front desk, we rang the bell, waking the clerk from the back. Her tired eyes flickered behind her glasses as she greeted us. "Excuse me, your ice machine is broken." "Do you have another one?" my granddad asked. "I'm sorry, it's supposed to be fixed next week, but that doesn't help you now," she replied, feigning sympathy. "Do you have anything in the back?" he pressed, peering over her shoulder. "No, I'm afraid not," she said, trying to hide her indifference. Granddad's expression soured. "Is there another place nearby?" "Unfortunately, they're closed," she said apologetically. "I'm sorry to bother you," she added. Granddad made a clicking sound with his tongue. "Can we at least get a refund for the ice machine?" he demanded. "Honestly, do you guys really like ice that much?" she shot back, looking bemused. "Listen, it's not like there's a sign out front saying ice guaranteed," he retorted, growing more frustrated. We turned to leave, and I looked back at the clerk's confused expression. My granddad was already halfway across the parking lot, moving with purpose. "Here you go," I said, handing the clerk the empty ice bucket. If you ever come back, I promise we'll have it fixed. Come on, Daniel. We've got to go, he called. I hurried to catch up, feeling a knot in my stomach. I'd never seen him this shaken before. I realized I'd left my comic book in the bathroom, so I dashed back to grab it, contemplating whether I should use the restroom again. Come on, Daniel. Hurry up, he shouted from the door. Hearing him yell was jarring. He had never raised his voice at me before. A flush of shame and anger washed over me, and I ducked my head, climbing into the passenger seat. He peeled out of the parking lot, and we sped away into the night, whatever was chasing us still lurking in the shadows. Neither of us spoke, and I felt like a reprimanded child, my pride wounded by his outburst. The questions swirled in my mind. What was happening? As we drove for nearly an hour, the forest loomed around us, dark and intimidating, stirring a primal fear within me. It felt as if we were crossing into a territory not meant for humans at this hour, a place where dangers lurked, waiting to drag you into the night, never to be heard from again. We stumbled upon a rest area, just a simple pull-off by the highway with a couple of picnic tables and some 55-gallon drums. This will do, he said, getting out of the car. What are we doing? I asked, confused. We're pulling off for the night, he replied. You can sleep in the back seat. I'll grab a blanket from the trunk. But why? What's wrong with the hotel? They had no ice, he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He yawned, stretching like a cartoon character. Little buddy, we better hit the sack while we can. We have a lot of miles to cover tomorrow. And that was that. I curled up in the back seat, using a towel as a pillow, and eventually drifted off to the sounds of birds chirping in the morning. Sunlight streamed through the trees as I realized my pants were crumpled on the floor. For a moment, I thought I'd wet myself, but it turned out to be just my soaked briefs from sleeping in the car on a muggy summer night. Grandpa wasn't in the front seat. I quickly pulled on my pants and stepped outside. He was sitting at one of the picnic tables, casually greeting me as if I had just woken up in the kitchen on a Sunday morning while he manned the waffle maker. It struck me how strange it was that we were out here after leaving the hotel in the night. Still groggy, I complained about our situation. Should we head down the road and find some food? He suggested. I asked why we had to sleep by the roadside and what had happened with leaving the hotel. My neck hurts from sleeping in the back, he said with a groan. It's a long story, kid. I'd rather not get into it now. Let's just make sure the next hotel has a good ice machine. No more sleeping on the roadside. I'll tell you when you're older. He promised he would, but it wouldn't be until much later, until he had passed away. I wasn't with him on that journey, that mission across the southeastern U.S. where we searched cemeteries for traces of lives once lived. That trip bonded us and we grew much closer, especially after my parents' separation. My mother moved us to his town, 3 hours away, and I stayed with him until I graduated high school. I didn't reach my 30s before he fell ill, a longtime smoker who hadn't quit until much later. He had been doing relatively well until lung cancer caught up with him. They thought they'd caught it early enough, and if he went through chemotherapy, his chances looked good. Even in his 70s, he seemed full of life, like he could live another decade or more if he beat it. Still, he hesitated to start treatment. I'm only doing this because your mother wants me to fight it. Otherwise, I'd just take my chances. I feel ready to see your grandmother, he said. At that time, I was married and out of state, making trips home when I could because I worried his time was short. The treatment for his cancer was a series of ups and downs, just attempts to pull free from the mud. It was near the end of his life when I received an unexpected email from him. It was a surprise since he rarely sent messages. He had always been resistant to modern technology until we finally got him a tablet with a keyboard. I was fortunate to read his email when I did. As soon as I finished, I informed my workplace there was an emergency, jumped in my car, and drove urgently back to my grandfather's hometown. Daniel, I guess I need to get this off my chest, and you're the only one who would truly understand. Remember that summer trip we took when your parents were having problems before they split? Remember that night we slept in the car because the hotel's ice machine was broken? I recalled that trip vividly. I was still grieving over your grandmother's loss and hadn't done much since. No church, no fishing, no weekend breakfasts. I worked, returned home, and sat around in that empty house. That trip had pulled me out of my funk. I knew I wasn't the most affectionate person. I had never been good at expressing feelings, but I was grateful you were there. Now, everything I'm about to say wouldn't have been shared if I didn't think it would be safe. It had been many years since those events took place. Your grandmother and I had traveled a lot since then, and as long as I did what I needed to, I was fine. It had been a few years since we returned from the war. I hadn't started school, so my GI Bill went unused. I hadn't proposed to your grandmother yet, but we were in the romance stage. Shane Albright, who served with me, told me about some jobs with the U.S. Forest Service, mentioning they were hiring veterans. We both signed on and got jobs as fire watchers, starting near our old hometown, but soon getting shuffled around to different sites across state lines. Those out-of-town gigs paid a bit more. We'd brave the roads in Shane's Studebaker, arriving at sites and stationed at lookout towers, scanning the forest for fires. After long stints, we'd return home, completely exhausted, with little memory of how we made it back. On one of those trips, as I drove with the AM radio playing, suddenly, a woman's voice broke through the static, singing Anchors Away. Shane, drowsy in the front seat, started to hum along. Then there was a burst of static, followed by sounds of explosions and alarms, mixed with a cheerful whistle. A lively male voice introduced himself as Buck Hensley, talking about flying the Enola Gay and how he never lost a wink of sleep despite what he had done, wiping out countless lives in Hiroshima. He claimed that bombing a city worked better than a nightcap or warm milk. Shane and I sat up, captivated by the broadcast. Buck then shared what he called the rules of the road. The first rule was that if we stopped at a hotel during our travels, we were to request ice for our room from the front desk staff. He predicted ice machines would soon become popular in hotels, which turned out to be true. However, there was something unsettling about his voice before his warning. The consequences of ignoring this rule were vague, mentioning a nighttime visitor who would give us cold feet. Buck bid us farewell, wishing us safe travels, and just like that, the radio returned to normal. We were back on the road, heading to our job. We stopped at a roadside inn similar to the ones we used to visit on our trips, just newer and less shabby. It was late when we arrived, and there wasn't a television in the room. Those were luxuries back then, just a radio on the dresser. I remembered Buck's warning. "Are you really going to do that?" Shane asked. "Sure, why not? The ice is free, and I could use a cold drink." They gave me a little ice bucket at the front desk for a nickel. "Well, if you got it, you might as well make use of it," Shane said, pulling a half pint of rye whiskey from his bag. We both had a drink. "Bet you didn't know your old man had it in him," I chuckled, "but I put that side of me away once your mother was born." That's how we all survived our first night in a hotel. After hearing that broadcast, we headed out to our worksite for a long stretch of fire watching and solitude. We were exhausted after a late drive, and even with our planned shifts, we wouldn't have made it home until late afternoon. Shane suggested we take a break and stop for a bite to eat at a little town diner, which had a burger joint, an inn, and a gas station. We had burgers, sodas, and fries, but time slipped away. By the time we got back to our room, all I wanted was to sleep. Shane, however, had other plans. He spotted a bar off the main drag and insisted I join him. I shrugged and followed. We played pool and had a few drinks. As the night wore on, Shane got cozy with a girl in a corner booth while I hung back, growing bored. I signaled that I was ready to leave, and Shane pulled me aside. "Listen, if we make the right choice now, we could end up back at the room," he winked. I just shrugged and wished him luck. When I got back to our room, I realized we only had one bed. Being so close together like this felt odd. If he brought a girl back to the room, things would get complicated, and I didn't want to be there, even with two beds. It was decision time. As tempting as the bed looked for my tired, worn-out body, I took one for the team. I made my way to the car and dozed off in the back seat of the old sedan. My sleep was light and restless, thoughts swirling in my mind when suddenly it hit me. The ice. We had forgotten the ice. I shot up and opened the door, not even sure what time it was. It was still dark outside, and the parking lot was eerily quiet. I headed for the hotel room door, my hand nearly reaching the handle when it creaked open and someone stepped out. It was the same girl from the bar, but she looked different in the orange hotel lights. Her skin appeared paler, and her eyes were the brightest blue I'd ever seen, shimmering almost. She smiled at me, her lips seeming to glisten as if coated in ice. "Your friends are tired," she said. That's when I noticed her shirt was unbuttoned, revealing her chest and the beating heart beneath her translucent skin. No, not skin, ice. I stumbled backward, nearly falling as I backed into the parking lot. I could hear her laughter fading into the night. Once I regained my balance, I rushed into our hotel room and flipped on the lights. There, on the bed, lay Shane, bare and unmoving, his face twisted in a strange angle. His body was stiff, his neck stretched back as far as it would go, his heels firmly planted, toes curled. "Shane, buddy, you okay?" I asked, feeling foolish for even speaking. There was no response. He didn't move at my touch. It felt like rigor mortis had already set in. Why was his body so cold? It looked as if he had frozen mid-motion. His expression could have been one of either pleasure or pain, and the tips of his limbs appeared frostbitten. I threw a sheet over his lower half and rushed to the hotel office to call for help. The paramedics arrived, puzzled by the lack of a clear cause of death. They speculated about a black widow spider bite causing muscle spasms. I mentioned seeing a woman leave the room, but didn't divulge the details about the bizarre broadcast or the icy-skinned girl. All these years later, my life has remained unchanged. The world keeps turning, seemingly in a predictable rhythm. The only thing that has altered is the heaviness I feel whenever I travel. Your grandmother used to tease me about my habit of recounting this story, though I always left out the most bizarre parts. I told her I shared it in memory of my friend Shane, taken too soon in an inexplicable way. You're the only one I've shared the entire story with. Here's the reason I've felt something's off these past few months. I have a cough, a deep, persistent one that I can't shake. Last week, the doctor took an X-ray and found a mass in my lungs, which he said looked inoperable. He offered chemotherapy, but I know where I stand on that. I'd rather go out on my own terms than wait for the disease to spread, deteriorating day by day. Now, I'm sitting in a small inn called the Relax Inn off the highway, right across from the blue strip burger joint we used to love. After I finish this recording, I plan to relax, watch some TV, smoke my first cigarette in 5 years, and drift off. I won't fill the ice bucket. I'll break the rules and wait for her to come to me in the dark. It seems like a fitting way to go out, better than a hospital bed. I hope you understand, love. Granddad Doug. P.S. I don't want to alarm you or cause you worry, but this is better this way. Feel free to call the authorities for a wellness check. I'd hate for you to find my body in an unsettling state. I'm in room 127. It took me about 2 hours to arrive at the Relax Inn. I replayed the story in my head the whole way here, finding it harder to believe with each passing moment. There were other ways he could have taken his own life. I'd seen the bottles of morphine tablets prescribed to him, the ones he rarely took. Granddad's burgundy Mercury was parked outside room 127, a faded Navy veteran sticker peeling off the back window. Fear gripped my stomach, and the old scent I'd put on earlier did nothing to mask the anxiety that was now soaking through my shirt. I thought about calling the authorities, but had already made a decision on the way here. I needed to see him one last time, to confront the reality of it. Approaching the door filled me with dread. I feared it would be locked and I'd have to turn back. But the key was left in the door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. Was I really ready to see my grandfather like this? His body stiff, frozen, an old icicle under the sheets? Did I ever truly believe his story? I took a deep breath and stepped inside. A Western flickered quietly on the TV, and there was a bucket in the center of the dresser. My grandfather Doug lay on the bed, curled on his side. The water in the ice bucket was still cold, but his body was warm. There was no heartbeat, no breath. His half-open eyes stared blankly into nothingness, pupils unresponsive. On the end table sat an empty prescription bottle and a note. It read, "I couldn't go through with it." I'm writing this hours before I fade away. Even now, I think about how it would be a great way to go out, but I'm scared, terrified of that woman with the cold lips and icy skin. How would it feel to die that way? But I think it's more than just fear. After your grandmother died, I never had another woman. How could I face her in heaven with that as my last act? Though I was cheated and have missed her every day, she was enough for a lifetime. I can wait just a little longer, so we can end up back where we began, me at a graveyard with Grandpa, except this time he's underground, and it's his gravestone I'm thinking about scrubbing, the one he shares with my grandmother. I won't go through with it. The act seems better suited to the older graves of nameless ancestors. But he was anything but nameless. He was my grandfather, a man I loved. I'll carry him with me in different ways. The calm demeanor I show, the way I furrow my brow when I'm lost in thought, my love for a good Western, and the ice bucket I'll fill at every motel. I find myself in that place.